If you're watching this video and you're 18, 20, 25, or even 30 and still living with your parents, there's absolutely nothing to feel bad about at all. The human brain doesn't finish developing until about the age of 25. This is a scientific and a psychological fact, not my personal opinion. And considering that we're living in a society and in an economy where most jobs that pay enough for a living are based on mental knowledge rather than physical labor, it's time we change societal norms to reflect that. This is just one of many scientific, cultural, and historical facts you will soon see, which prove the cultural expectation for young people to move out at 18 is completely unrealistic and outdated. Part 1. The history. The unrealistic expectation for young people to move out and be financially independent at 18 mainly stems from, you guessed it, delusional boomers, thinking that it's still 1960. Boomers are literally mentally incapable of realizing that the world can change over the course of 65 years, and they ignorantly project their own experiences with the booming post-war 1960s economy onto us. Back then, anyone could get a decent job. Rent was $70 a month, and the average person could buy a house within 2 years of working. Yeah, if rent was $70 a month, I would move out too. Hell, if it was even $700 a month, it would be a lot more bearable. Since boomers are incapable of comprehending that the world can change over the course of 65 years, let's apply their own logic to them and see what happens when we force them to live by cultural norms set 60 years before their time. You see, in a couple of days here, it's going to officially be the year 2025. This means that more time will have passed between now and 1960 than 1960 and 1900. So, if boomers want us to live by the cultural norms of the 1960s, it's only fair that they themselves live by the cultural norms of the 1900s. What would happen if boomers had to live by their own outdated cultural standards? Let's find out. 1900 marked one of the last years of the Victorian era. If you know anything about history, you'll know that this was one of the most brutal times to be alive. The working conditions people were subjected to back then are something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. But again, since boomers want us to live by cultural norms established 60 years before our time, it's only fair that they themselves live by cultural norms established 60 years before their time. And since boomers expect us to get a job and move out at 18, let's ask what age were you expected to move out and get a job in the Victorian era? The answer is as young as 10 years old. The Industrial Revolution created a ton of new jobs as huge factories sprang up everywhere to produce goods. However, since jobs were so abundant, this also meant that workers' wages were extremely low. So low that this meant every member of the family had to work in order to support each other. According to the official source of the UK government itself, families often had 7 or more children, and finding enough food for everyone to eat was a struggle. Sending your child away to find work or agreeing for them to be bound to an apprentice for several years meant that you had one less mouth to feed. If you think this sounds cruel and inhumane, wait until you hear about the insane Victorian era working conditions that children were subjected to. According to the same source, thousands of children worked in the city factories, at coal mines, and in the homes of the wealthy. Children were cheap to pay and could be bullied and forced to carry out the jobs that no one else wanted to do. The working day was long. Children often spent 12 hours in physically demanding jobs, leaving them exhausted. If they fell asleep whilst at work, children could be beaten by the factory foreman and have their wages docked. In the early part of the 19th century, few laws existed to protect children, and these laws were often ignored by factory owners anyway. They go on to say, working families would have had little money to spend on food, and their poor diets meant that children didn't grow properly, were weak, or developed rickets. It was usual for children to go to bed every night feeling hungry. Being weak and working in dirty, dangerous conditions, with no safety equipment or protective clothing, meant that children died either at work or as the result of hard work. I think we all get the picture of how brutal things were by now. So the next time one of your boomer parents tells you that you should move out and have a job at 18, because that's what they did 60 years ago, ask them if they were doing brutal child labor for 12 hours a day in a Victorian era factory from the time they were 10. If they weren't then, I guess that means that they're lazy and entitled and soft, according to their own logic. One thing I really want to emphasize here is that the expectation for children to work in these brutal factory conditions from the age of 10 wasn't just an economic necessity, it was a cultural expectation. In fact, in the year 1880, laws were passed that made it mandatory for children between the ages of 5 to 10 to be in school. You would think parents back then would be rejoicing this, but no, they were actually furiously upset because it meant that their 5-year-olds wouldn't be able to work to support themselves. Sounds a lot like how your asshole boomer parents are furiously upset with you for not being able to work to support yourself at 18. In fact, you could easily make the argument that it's even more unreasonable now, because as bad as working conditions were back then, there at least was a job available to everyone who needed a job. We all know that in the present day, the economy sucks so bad, you can't get a job even if you want one. As awful, brutal, and horrific as cultural expectations were back then, they were at least rooted in some form of reality. As awful as jobs were back then, it was at least possible and even easy to get them. Boomers, on the other hand, aren't just expecting you to do something that's horrible and awful, they're expecting you to do something that's literally impossible for most young people in this economy. Hopefully, this exposes just how despicable and hypocritical the boomer generation is. They want you to live by cultural expectations set 60 years before your time. But they themselves would never, ever in a million years, agree to living by cultural expectations set 60 years before their time. Part 2. No one does this in other countries. I traveled over 25 countries in my personal decade-long journey in escaping the 9 to 5. I've been to almost all of Europe and about half of Asia. Traveling the world is an incredibly enlightening experience. I consider it to be a much more valuable education than college. You get to see how people live in other countries and cultures and compare and contrast it to your own. One thing the political right absolutely detests is the idea of cultural relativism, the idea that every culture is equal. The thing is, I actually agree with them that some cultures do things better than others. But where I find them to be quite ignorant is the fact that they only use cultural relativism as a one-way street to justify why America is better than other cultures. If you're going to admit that some cultures are better than others, you have to also be willing to accept that other cultures are better than America as well. And when it comes to allowing young people to live with their parents for essentially as long as they want, every country in Europe and Asia does this way better than America. In most Eastern European countries, it's common for kids to just live with their parents all the way up to the age of 30 or until they get married. In South Korea, 57% of young adults between the ages of 18 to 30 still live with their parents. I touched on this in a previous video, and I got a bit roasted in the comments from European Zoomers telling me that things aren't much better in Europe either. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Europe or Asia is an economic utopia for young people. I get that there are definitely problems everywhere right now. But as a young American who traveled here, it definitely seemed like a utopia compared to how big of a third world shithole America has become. Because young people can live with their parents without social stigma for as long as they want, you just don't see the problems of massive homeless populations, egregious amounts of student loan debts, and a completely desolate, hopeless future. For example, I have a Korean friend who lived with his parents until he was 30. He was a bit lost and unsure about what to do with his life after he completed Korea's mandatory military service, and instead of being assholes, kicking him out expecting him to pay $2,000 a month in rent at 18. They patiently let him save money and figure out his life. He eventually found a good study program and completed it while living with his parents, and he now has a very good job with the government at the age of 30. Only then did he move out when he was actually ready, and today, he's comfortably living on his own, without being drowned in debt. This is just superior in every way to what we do in the West, where we kick people out at 18, in this insane rental market in the name of some fucked up idea of being independent. Except, they're not really even going to be independent because they're just going to be switching their dependency from their parents to student loans and debt. So the whole idea is just flat out stupid. Thankfully, this does appear to be changing as more and more Gen Z in America have seen how bullshit this all is and are choosing to live with their parents for longer. And to that, I say, more power to you. This is just another reason why Gen Z is awesome. This is a cultural change that should have happened a long-ass time ago. Part 3. The science. I mentioned in the beginning of this video that the human brain isn't fully developed until the age of 25, and I want to revisit this as it's an important point. One thing Gen Z is often criticized for is the fact that they won't grow up and become adults. What gets completely lost in this whole discourse, however, is that the idea that you should be beholden to adult responsibilities at 18 is just a subjective, cultural notion with absolutely no facts or science behind it. Think about it. What is magical about the age of 18 that makes it different from being 17, 16, or 15? Absolutely nothing. In fact, all the actual scientific evidence out there shows the exact opposite. If there is a magical age of adulthood, it would be more around the age of 25, as this is when you are actually mentally fully developed. The scientific data and anecdotal evidence both back this up. I'm sure any of you out there who are 25 or up can personally attest to how much you mentally changed as a person between the ages of 18 to 25. When you combine this with the fact that most jobs that actually even pay you enough to live on your own in the modern day and age are of the mental, cognitive variety and not physical labor, it only makes sense that you're not expected to live on your own until your mental, cognitive abilities are fully developed. A common fallacy that's easy to fall for when we analyze history is the misconception that we are living at the end of history right now. No, one day we will be the ones in history books, being studied and judged by future generations 100 years later, in the same way we look back and judge people in the Victorian era 100 years ago. And I believe in the year 2100 people are going to look back at our insane cultural expectations of expecting people to move out at 18 in this dog shit economy and rental market. In the exact same way we look back at the cultural expectation of people in the Victorian era being expected to move out and be financially independent at the age of 10. Horrible, ridiculous, inhumane, and unfair.